The wind swept dry across the mesa, hissing through sagebrush and sun-bleached cattle bones, the only sounds aside from the scuff of worn boots on dust. Ephraim Cade had the look of a man carved from old stone, lined face, hollow eyes, a beard grown out more from neglect than style. He rode a bony bay gelding with a limp in its left foreleg, and behind him clanked a rattling wagon that once carried a wife and son, and now bore only fencing wire and sorrow. He came down off the North Ridge into the town of Olvido, a cracked little blot of civilization baked into the canyon floor. It had a sheriff, a gallows, a boarding house, and 4 grave markers without names. The rest was grit and old sins. Ephraim didn't mean to stop, but the gelding gave out just outside the livery, and when he dismounted, his legs wobbled beneath him like he'd been at sea. 3 days without a real meal. 5 without sleep. He was arrested 2 hours later. A man named Boyd Laskin, a loud drunk with silver rings on every finger, lay sprawled behind the saloon with his face caved in and a Colt .45 still clutched in his stiff hand. Witnesses swore they saw Ephraim and Boyd fighting outside not an hour before, after Boyd called Ephraim a grave sitter and spit in his drink. No one saw the killing, but they didn't need to. Boyd was the banker's nephew. Ephraim was a stranger with no friends, no alibi, and blood on his boots. Sheriff Harlan Tice was a man past his usefulness, lazy-eyed, sweat-stained, too fond of corn liquor. But even he looked uneasy when he cuffed Ephraim and threw him in the cell behind the courthouse. It was a trial-by-necessity town, and they didn't like leaving bodies too long before the hangman's noose got tested again. The judge was due in a week. Ephraim said nothing when they questioned him. He sat on the cot and stared at the wall like he was watching something far off. Maybe it was his wife, Annie, 4 years in the dirt. Maybe it was his boy, drowned in the little Sabine Creek one spring the floods came early. Maybe it was nothing at all. He wouldn't say, wouldn't plead, wouldn't cry. On the 5th day, the church bells rang. It was market day. People came out with squash and hides and bad coins. The gallows creaked as the sun rose behind it, shadow long and pointed toward the jail. That was when she stepped from the crowd, barefoot in a dress too big, its hem stitched from scraps. The girl couldn't have been more than 14, dirt-smudged, half-wild, with a look in her eyes like a snake that hadn't yet struck but could. She had a bandaged hand and a cracked voice. She pointed straight at Ephraim, chained between 2 deputies. "He's my husband," she said. The world tilted. Silence fell over the crowd like a dropped veil. Then came the murmurs. Old Mrs. Crawley gasped. The blacksmith snorted. Sheriff Tice squinted like he'd gone blind. "You say what now, girl?" he asked. "I said he's my husband," she repeated. "By Bible, by promise, by law if it comes to that." Someone laughed, someone cursed, someone whispered child bride, but Ephraim didn't speak. He looked at her the way a wolf might look at a flame, uncertain if it would warm him or eat him alive. "What's your name?" the sheriff asked. Clara Vexley Cade." "That ain't a name belongs to anyone I ever heard of." "Don't mean it ain't real." Sheriff Tice scratched his chin. He stared between the girl and the man, then looked toward the judge's quarters like he could put the whole mess on someone else's shoulders. "Where you come from, Clara?" "From over the pass, from dirt and pigs and things ain't worth telling." "You got proof of this marriage?" "No, but neither do you got proof it ain't." It was a standoff of logic and law, and in that moment the town teetered. Ephraim watched her with narrowed eyes, the faintest tilt of his head betraying thought. This girl, this stranger, had just tied herself to him in front of half the county, and not to save him, at least not that he could tell, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had just picked a side. "Why would you say such a thing?" Sheriff Tice asked her, voice low. Clara crossed her arms, her bare toes curled in the dust. "Because if you hang him, I ain't got no husband, and I ain't letting you take a second one from me." There was something broken in her voice, something that told of a life scraped together from the bones of worse things. Ephraim didn't speak. but he nodded, slow, once. "I'll be damned," the sheriff muttered. The judge arrived the next morning, and with him came the trial. It was to be quick, but the marriage claims stalled things. Clara was called as witness. She told a story stitched from old fabric and made believable through the grit in her teeth. They met a year ago, she said. He found her bleeding by the creek after her uncle beat her for eating eggs that weren't hers. Ephraim nursed her back. He asked nothing in return but her safety. They'd wed under the stars, a piece of ribbon for a ring, a prayer spoken into the ground. There were no records, no preacher, no friends, but when she took the stand and looked the judge square in the eye, no one could say she lied. Not because the story made sense, but because it hurt, like a truth made out of pain. "He ain't a killer," Clara said. "He's just tired, like me, like anyone would be after too long in a bad world." The jury deliberated 2 hours. In the end, they called it uncertain cause of death, though no one quite believed Boyd tripped and shot himself in the face. They freed Ephraim Cade at dusk. He stood outside the jailhouse with the girl beside him, both of them too still, too quiet. She looked up at him. He looked down. No words passed between them. They walked away together. Behind them, the gallows remained. And so the story began. They left Oviedo by the south road, walking until the dark swallowed their shapes whole. Ephraim hadn't spoken in hours, and the girl hadn't expected him to. She trailed a few steps behind, her feet bruised, dressed damp from creek water where she'd washed the lies off her skin. But the story she'd told, that didn't wash away. It followed them like breath. They slept in a gully that night, under a sky so clear it seemed to crack. Ephraim didn't ask her why she did what she did. Clara didn't offer. They shared a strip of jerky and half a stale biscuit. In the morning, he gave her his dead wife's boots, still tucked in the back of the wagon, and she laced them tight around her skinny ankles like armor. "Where we headed?" she asked once, voice flat. "Nowhere as good as anywhere." It was the first thing he'd said since the trial. They traveled south toward brush country, where the hills rolled like slumped shoulders and the heat carried stories in the air, gunfire, wolves, the metal tang of ambition. They passed ghost homesteads and old buffalo traces, a collapsed rail line that hadn't seen a train since the war. Ephraim traded fence wire for flour in a nameless town. Clara caught a rattler and skinned it for stew. He didn't ask where she'd learned to handle a blade that clean. By the time they reached Juniper Pass, word of the trial had moved faster than they had. Folks stared, some laughed, some spat. The world didn't like a man with a child bride, even when he never laid a hand on her. But Clara stood close to him, not out of fear, but ownership. If they hated her for her lies, she would wear that hate like a coat. In Juniper Pass, Ephraim found work mending corrals for a rancher too old to ride. Clara scrubbed clothes at the creek for pennies. They rented a linta behind the saddlery, with a broken stovepipe and a roof that whistled when it rained. There was one bed. She slept with her boots on, a knife tucked in her sleeve. He never touched her, never so much as looked at her when she undressed behind the wagon tarp nailed to the wall. They didn't speak much, but they moved together like animals who'd survived the same fire. Then, on a Sunday in late August, the man from Oviedo rode into town. Marshal Taggart, tall, lean, sunburnt to leather. He wore a badge and a snarl, both faded with use. He came looking not for justice, but vengeance. Boyd Laskin's uncle, the banker, had money and reach. Said Ephraim Cade had escaped noose by deceit, and if the courts wouldn't fix it, the lawmen would. Taggart didn't come with a warrant, just 2 riders and a quiet sort of menace. Found Ephraim at the smithy, hammer in hand. Clara saw it unfold from across the road. "You Cade?" Taggart asked. Ephraim didn't answer. "I heard you got yourself a wife, real young thing. What you trade for her, a busted saddle and a bag of cornmeal." Still Ephraim didn't speak, just stared, heat rising in him like iron warming in a forge. "I come to ask nice," Taggart said. You ride back with me, stand proper trial in Port Aline, or I drag you chained. Already stood trial, Ephraim said. Wasn't found guilty. Then we do it again. That girl lied. Everyone knows it. Town's talking. Judge in Port Aline don't take kindly to mockery of the bench. I didn't mock nothing, Clara said. She stood there now, boots planted, knife in hand, eyes like gunpowder. Taggart turned, grinned. You the little bride, he said. Your mama know where you sleep at night. My mama's dead, and you ain't gonna lay a finger on him. Taggart didn't flinch, just looked from her to Ephraim, then back. Funny, he said. Looks like your daddy got himself in deep. That was the moment Ephraim moved. He didn't swing the hammer, just stepped between them, slow, shoulders set. She said it plain, you'll lave us be. You threatenin' a marshal of the territory. No, I'm telling you, I've buried worse. Taggart studied him a long time, then spat in the dirt. This ain't done, he said, not near. He left that day, but Ephraim knew it was only the beginning. The kind of men who wore the law like a coat they could take off when the sun got hot, they never quit easy. That night Ephraim sat outside the lean-to, sharpening his knife under the stars. Clara brought him black coffee and a blanket. She didn't ask what he planned. You were married before, she said quietly. Yeah. Did you love her? I tried to. What happened to her? He paused, then said, Same thing happens to most women out here. The world. Clara sat beside him, her knees drawn up. Why'd you let me lie? She asked. Ephraim didn't answer right away. He worked the blade, slow and steady. Didn't seem like a lie, he said finally. They stayed quiet after that. But in the dark something shifted. Not love, not trust, something harder, like iron cooling into shape. They left Juniper Pass the next morning. Because Ephraim Cade had killed a man. And Clara Vexley had lied to save him. And the law was coming. Not with papers, but with fire. They crossed the Devil's Draw by moonlight, the wagon stripped down to little more than wheels and spine. Ephraim led the mule on foot, rifle slung over his shoulder, boots caked in red mud from the river shallows. Clara rode beside, knees pulled up in the saddle, her bandaged hand wrapped tight around the reins like she could will the beast forward by hate alone. 3 towns behind them now. Ephraim worked where he could. Clara stole where she had to. Once, when they stopped in Dustfall to trade for bullets and beans, she snuck into the sheriff's office and tore down the wanted poster nailed up beside the door. Her hands trembled when she brought it back. WANTD 4 questioning. EPHRAMCADE, husband of false minor bride, possible fugitive. They burned it that night, dry grass crackling in the flames, smoke rising without scent. Ephraim didn't speak much of it. He rarely did. But Clara watched the way he sat apart from the fire, staring into the dark like there was something out there with his name in its mouth. 3 days later, they found a body strung up in a cottonwood. Male, middle-aged, no boots, rope burn around the neck, face swollen beyond recognition, a sign nailed to his chest. This is what happens to girl thieves. Ephraim cut the man down with his teeth clenched. Clara didn't cry. She just stood there, fists in her coat pockets, nails digging into her palms until they left crescent moons of blood. Wasn't meant for us, she said after a while. No, Ephraim said, but it was. They buried the man without a name. Ephraim said a prayer he half remembered from a chapel somewhere before the war. Clara didn't know God, but she listened close anyway. That night they didn't make a fire. They kept riding west toward high country where the marshals didn't bother to ride. By the time the snow started falling in Bitterroot Valley, Clara had stopped being a girl. She still had the face of one, soft in some places, sharp in others, but her eyes had changed. They no longer asked questions, they watched. Ephraim taught her to shoot. She took to it like it was something she'd always known. On the second day, she cracked a bottle from 50 yards, then looked at him not with pride, but hunger. "They'll come again," she said. "Next time I'll be ready." "You think shooting's gonna fix it?" he asked. "No, but it'll slow it down." They took shelter with an old prospector named Ridge who owed Ephraim from the war. Ridge didn't ask about the girl, just coughed, spat into a tin cup, and waved them toward the goat shed behind his cabin. It was warm enough, and Clara patched the holes in the roof herself. Snow came heavy that winter. They lived on root vegetables, wild rabbit, and silence. Ephraim mended a saddle he didn't need. Clara read the only book in the shack, the Book of Judges, until the pages were nearly see-through. At night, they played a game. Clara would say a name, and Ephraim would say what he thought they'd done. Murderer, preacher, thief, whore. None of the names were real, but the answers might have been. Once Clara said, "Clara Cade." Ephraim didn't answer. She said it again, "What's she done?" He looked at her, long and steady. "She survived." That spring, Ridge died in his sleep. Ephraim dug the grave while Clara watched the sun rise over the pines. They left 2 days later, following the river north until they crossed into logging country. They found a town called Watch Bend, built like a bruise against the cliffs. It had lumberyards, miners, and a sheriff who didn't care where a man came from as long as he paid his taxes and didn't shoot up the saloon. Clara got work as a runner for the telegraph office. Ephraim took up cutting timber. No one asked questions. For 6 weeks, they lived like the world had forgotten them. She began to laugh again, soft and rare, usually when Ephraim slipped in the mud or cursed at the mule. He bought her a red kerchief from a traveling merchant. She wore it around her throat like it meant something. Then a man with a northern accent came to town. Tall, slick, with a gray coat and no dust on his boots. He bought drinks for strangers. He asked polite questions about a man named Cade and the girl who rode with him. Clara saw him first. She waited till Ephraim came off the ridge, his shirt soaked through with sweat and sawdust. "He's here," she said. Ephraim didn't ask who. That night they packed everything. They didn't say goodbye. They left behind 2 weeks' pay, a kettle, and the best peace they'd ever had. On the road again, always on the road. They stopped once, 2 days later, in the ruins of a church. The roof was gone, and the altar was scorched black. Clara sat in one of the old pews while Ephraim leaned against the doorway. "I think I'm becoming what they said I was," she said. "What's that?" "A wife." Ephraim didn't smile, but something in his face softened. "You ain't that." "What am I?" He looked at her then, fully, like he had the first time outside the jailhouse in Oviedo. "You're the reason I ain't dead." She nodded as if that settled something inside her. Then they left the church behind. Ahead of them, the hills grew steeper. Behind them, the men with badges were still coming. They came down into Rook Valley during the dying days of summer, where the trees grew bent and the rivers ran low with glacial melt. A sawmill town stood crooked along the slope, held together by pitch and grudges, its church bell missing, its jailhouse sagging into its foundation. The people here didn't talk unless they had to. That suited Ephraim and Clara fine. They called themselves kin again, Mr. and Mrs. Cade, to rent a cabin on the edge of town. The walls were moss-eaten, the chimney choked. Clara swept it clean. Ephraim patched the lakes. They lived as if they belonged. He found work shoeing horses for a widow with bad knees and a sharp tongue. Clara traded pelts and handmade soap at the outpost store. She carried a small pistol now, holstered under her arm, never drawing attention to it but never far from its weight. The shopkeep once asked where her folks were. She said, dead. He didn't ask again. Weeks passed, no signs of pursuit, no mention of marshals. Clara began to think maybe the world had finally grown tired of chasing them. Then came the fire. It started in the woods, 3 miles west, in a clearing where no lightning had struck. By the time the flames reached the outskirts of town, 4 cabins were ash and a stable full of livestock burned alive. Clara stood in the smoke with wet cloth over her mouth and watched the roof of the chapel fall. Her eyes watered, but not from the heat. Ephraim came back black with soot, shoulders sagged. "Wasn't natural," he said. "What was it?" "A message." They found it 2 days later. A scrap of canvas nailed to the bark of a split pine near the trailhead. "Coward, husband, liar. Give her up or the next town burns." Ephraim read it once, then tore it down. That night Clara stood barefoot in the cold, holding the pistol in both hands, watching the woods like they might crawl open and reveal the end of her. "We can't run forever," she said. "No." "I can go," she offered. "Separate, give them what they want." Ephraim looked at her hard. "You think this is still about you?" She didn't answer. He stepped closer. "They don't want justice, they want obedience. They want to take what's left of us and make it theirs." Clara nodded, teeth gritted. "Then let them come." They spent 3 days preparing. Ephraim rigged traps through the narrow switchbacks that led into the valley, pitfalls, trip wires, a hunting blind with sharpened poles. Clara oiled every gun. She learned how to load the rifle without looking, how to move through trees without snapping a twig. They slept in turns. They counted bullets. And then the strangers came. 5 of them, men on horses, dressed in dust and spurs, badges tucked into coat pockets like afterthoughts. Taggart wasn't among them, but Clara saw the same kind of cold in their eyes. They came at dusk, just as the fog began to coil down the mountain. The cabin windows glowed faint. The men didn't knock. They lit torches. "Cade," one of them called, "you got something belongs to us. Give her over and we leave you breathing." No answer. Then a shot rang out, not from them, but from inside. The lead rider's horse screamed, legs shattered and crumpled beneath him. Clara stood in the doorway, rifle braced. "You want me," she said. "Come take me." Then the woods came alive. Traps snapped, brush exploded. Ephraim moved like a shade among trees, picking them off one by one. He didn't shoot to kill, not always, but he made it hurt. He made them remember. The fight wasn't long, but it was savage. Blood in the dirt, smoke thick in the branches. Clara took a bullet in the thigh and bit down on a strip of leather to keep from screaming. When it was over, 2 men were dead. 2 fled limping into the woods. 1 lay moaning by the cabin, arm blown clean off. Ephraim dragged the bodies to the clearing and stacked them. Clara poured oil. They watched them burn. She sat on the porch after, leg bandaged, blood caked on her collar. "I thought it'd feel better," she said. "Surviving don't feel good, just necessary." She looked up at him, eyes raw. "We started something, didn't we?" Ephraim nodded. "Yeah, and it ain't done." In the morning, they packed again. Clara left behind the red kerchief. Ephraim left the mule. They took only what they needed: guns, salt, water, and each other. Because now the law had bled. And blood called for blood. The first snow came early to the high ridge country. The sky turned the color of old bone, and the ground froze hard before the leaves were done falling. Ephraim and Clara crossed the Blackstone Range with rifles wrapped in oilcloth and breath clouding before them. Their horses moved slow, lungs stinging with frost. Neither of them spoke much now. There was little to say. The killing in Rook Valley had scattered their enemies but not quieted them. There would be more. There was always more. The mountains gave way to a basin lined with dry trees and pale stones, a country that felt ancient and watching. Game was scarce. The wind was cruel, but they kept moving west always, toward the line where maps went blank. In a mining camp called Lorne's Hollow, they slept 4 nights beneath a tarpaulin behind a church with no steeple. Ephraim took work digging graves for men who died of lung rot and whiskey. Clara stitched the shoulder of a miner's coat for coins that jingled like teeth in her pocket. There was peace in that hollow, a quiet without threat, but Ephraim didn't trust it. He walked the edges of the camp each night, rifle cradled, boots soft in the dirt, and Clara, she did something strange. She prayed, not to be spared, not even to be forgiven, just to be remembered, perhaps, that her story would not end in a cold ditch beside a forgotten river. On the 5th night, a rider came through, coat dusted with frost, face veiled in a wool scarf. He stopped at the general store, whispered something, and left again without lighting a fire or buying a thing. Clara watched him from the edge of the butcher's stall. She didn't tell Ephraim until morning. He didn't answer, just tightened the cinch on her saddle and said, "We ride now." They left before the sun climbed the ridgeline. No trail, just instinct and caution. Ephraim kept them to the shadows, cutting through gullies and burned-out timber stands. He was thinner now, his beard grown wild, his coat stitched with blood at the seams. Clara matched his pace without complaint. She no longer limped. 4 days out they reached a place marked only by a cairn of bones and rusted wire. Ephraim had known of it once, an old Ute trading post, long abandoned, where the land bent into a natural bowl, cliffs on 3 sides, one narrow path in. A place to stand one last time. Because he was done running. Clara knew it before he said a word. They set the traps again, dug pits, laid sharpened stakes, repaired the old stone walls where they could and left gaps where they couldn't. There was a single rain barrel, 2 rifles, and enough shot to last maybe half a fight. Clara sat by the fire that night, stitching a patch on Ephraim's sleeve. "You think we make it out of this one?" "No." She nodded. "I'm glad," she said. He looked at her. "I don't mean I want to die," she said. "I mean I'm glad I got to choose the hill." The night before it happened, they didn't sleep. They sat with their backs to the stone wall, weapons beside them, fire low. Ephraim told her about Annie for the first time, how she laughed when she was dying, how their boy never spoke a word in his life but hummed like a bird in the mornings. Clara listened with her hand around his, steady and small. At dawn, the riders came. 7 of them, all in gray coats. Taggart was with them this time. His face older, skin drawn tight, eyes like something eaten hollow by fire. "Cade," he called from the ledge, "you still breathing?" Ephraim didn't answer. "You got something belongs to the law. You got something don't belong to you." Clara rose to stand beside Ephraim. Her rifle leaned against her leg. Taggart squinted. "You the girl." "No," she said. "I'm the storm that's gonna take your name off every ledger you ever wrote." He laughed. "You hear that, boys? She thinks this is a tale, that it ends the way she picks." "It ends with fire," Ephraim said. And then it did. The traps snapped. Gunfire cracked the cold air. The first 2 riders never made it to the ground. The others surged forward, forced into the bowl where escape meant climbing, and the only path out had been blocked with felled trees. Ephraim moved like a man who'd waited his whole life to be cornered. Clara was faster. They fought side by side. She covered him when he reloaded. He knocked a man from the ledge with a shot that cracked bone, but bullets run out, flesh tears, even the strong bleed. Clara took one in the ribs, another in the shoulder. She didn't fall. Ephraim caught a knife between the ribs. He didn't cry out. They made it to the final wall. 3 men remained, including Taggart, all bleeding, all maddened by the blood. One raised a pistol toward Clara. Ephraim threw himself into the shot. It caught him in the throat. He dropped without sound. Clara didn't scream. She lifted the shotgun and fired once, twice. The first man's skull split. The second stumbled backward over the edge. Only Taggart remained. He raised his hands, half laughing, half sobbing. "You think you win," he said. "You think anyone gives a damn what you done." Clara stepped over Ephraim's body. "You took him from me," she said. "You were a lie from the start." She fired. The last sound Taggart heard was her voice. "So was your justice." Afterward, she dragged Ephraim's body to the cairn, laid him beneath it, covered him in stones. She didn't cry. She stitched her wounds, saddled her horse, and rode west. No one ever found the bodies. No lawman dared chase her again. Her name passed through towns like a fable, the girl who lied to save a man, then became the fire they feared. Some say she settled in the cliffs past the Red Divide, became a ghost woman who guarded the trail with a rifle and a red cloth tied around her throat. Others say she rode to the coast, found the sea, and let it take her. But in the still places, where wind whistles through old bones and ravens perch on burned fences, folks still whisper. She said he was her husband. And then she made it true.